Oh, okay.
Right, that's a whole other story.
Because I have a visiting postdoc coming in and
seated. Hi, could everyone get seated, please? Thank you. Howard, could you get seated? Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. It is great to be here. It's great to be here with so many people I care about. It actually feels a little bit like my wedding when I was looking out at all of you. I want to talk about the plan for today, but I also wanted just to say a few words about Catherine and Bob and Howard before we got started. I met Catherine. Where is Catherine? Over here. I met Catherine 35 years ago. Because she was the one who was speaking to me about a revision I had to do in my qualifying paper. And I was told that she was going to be pretty direct. And I didn't quite know what that meant. But I will say that she was direct, but she was also fair and generous and insightful and incisive and decent. And she's been those qualities, she's been those things for the last 35 years. She's somebody I've really gone to in the clutch on many different things. And she also, to paraphrase the novelist Walker Percy, has an incredibly healthy nose for every species of mare that flies. And I learned early on in my career never to bullshit Catherine Snow. When I think back about my time at HGSE, I will think a lot about my walks with Bob Selman. And Bob Selman encouraged me during that time to think hard about how I spend my time and how to spend my time most meaningfully, that this life is not a dress rehearsal and we better dig into ourselves and figure out what we want to do. And I realized that Bob was choosing to spend his time taking these walks with me and caring and attending to me. And he has been a wonderful mentor to me and to many other people, and I want to thank him, a big heartfelt thanks to him for that. Howard, I'm going to say something about at the very end, but I want you to know that Howard is the one who inspired this session. He orchestrated this session. This session is largely in his honor. And in planning this session with him, I've been very moved by his enthusiasm, his understanding and his enthusiasm for the work of other people, including the handful of people that you are going to hear from today. So let me tell you the plan. We are going to start with Chuck Nelson, followed by Nancy Hill, followed by Katie Davis. They're each going to speak for 12 minutes or so. Then I'm going to moderate a conversation between Kathy McCartney and Marcelo Suarez Orozco, and Bill Damon is going to join us virtually, so that we will try to have this virtual, part here, part virtual conversation. And I think then we'll have time for Q&A. We'll probably have about a half an hour for Q&A, and I'm going to ask all the panelists, everybody to get up on the stage for the Q&A. So let's get going. Are you ready to go, Chuck? Great. So Chuck, as many of you may know, explores cognitive developmental neuroscience. He runs a lab on cognitive developmental neuroscience, and he is going to talk today about some of the key ways that neuroscience has contributed to our understanding of human development. Thank you, Chuck.
So in medical schools, usually you start a talk with your disclosures, like I own a drug company or I make money from a drug company. Usually involves drugs and companies. I have two disclosures. One is I had very bad spatial ability. The reason that's relevant is although Rick gave me a very detailed roadmap about his expectations, I can't read maps, so I have no idea if what I'm going to do is what Rick had in mind. And the second is that I've been at Harvard a little less than 15 years, but only a third of that has been in the ed school, and of that third, only 25% of has been here. So I don't have the long historical perspective that many do. For example, I haven't co-authored papers with Moses, with like Catherine and Meredith have, on writing a tablet, or I haven't co-authored papers with Rousseau or Hume the way Paul has. In my case, my look back really starts in the 1970s and 80s. So my job is to integrate neuroscience, developmental psychology, and education, and I'm going to do that now in about 11 minutes. So in the late 70s, early 80s, there were a few studies using EEG to interrogate brain function and cognitive and perceptual development, but it was really grounded in psychophysiology. That is, it really didn't pay much attention to deep underlying neurobiology as much as it was a developmental or dependent measure like anything else would be. So you could argue that the fields of developmental neuroscience and developmental psychology had not yet gone on their first date in the 1970s and 80s. So the reason I introduced Bill Greeno is that while developmental psychology was relatively brainless through the 1970s and 80s, by which I mean not grounded in neuroscience. It was not a pejorative comment I was making. That was not true in neuroscience. The people in developmental neuroscience were paying very close attention to behavioral development. And a good example is the work from Bill Greeno, who was an important mentor to me. So Bill had methodically studied how experience and environments weave their way into the developing brain. And he built on work that Donald Hebb actually had done starting in the 1930s, work that Catherine and I were exposed to when we were at McGill, and then later taken up by Diamond and Rosenzweig on so-called enriched environments, which actually eventually led to Head Start. Greeno's work came to the attention, I think, of developmental psychologists with this very seminal paper, which was published in 1987. And this paper has been cited 2,000 times by now. And I think Greeno's work would be eventually very important in the field of developmental psychology for a couple of reasons. It's really hard to see those slides. The problem is you can't read without reading glasses, and you can't see far away. I guess you just can't see. So Greeno's work was a mechanistic explanation for how experience and environments actually get under the skin. He also talked about, it came on the heels of this ascendancy of statistical genetics or behavior genetics. And where this was important is that behavior genetics really was very descriptive. It parsed the variance by saying 50% of IQ is genetic. But it wasn't mechanistic at all. It failed to identify genes or gene products that were involved in behavior. And it was very descriptive. And it didn't tell us the fact that genes got expressed in the brain, which then regulated behavior. Bill's work went beyond that by being much more mechanistic. So I was very influenced by Bill's work, and which then led about 10 years later to myself and Floyd Bloom publishing this paper, which came out in Child Development. Around the same time I was an editor of Child Development, but there was not a conflict of interest there at all. This is not me, this is the same mustache, but this is Floyd Bloom, who, when we wrote this paper, was the editor of Science. And we argue that advances in a number of areas of neuroscience had implications for those studying behavioral development. One was in neuroimaging. So neuroimaging had the promise to elucidate the neural bases or the neural correlates of behavior. We also talked about the important role that experience plays in the developing brain, which moved us away from this fixed position that genetics determine things. We took the position that experience plays a very important role in brain development. We talked about critical periods, emphasizing that there are windows of opportunity and vulnerability in brain development that can have a profound impact, not just on the short term, but on the long term, and that these critical periods would also limit the kinds of changes in brain function that are possible throughout the lifespan. So in the remainder of my talk today, I want to give a couple of examples of how I think developmental psychology and education has benefited from neuroscience. So the first one is that brain development is powerfully influenced by experience. We know that children deprived of typical auditory or visual development will wind up with deficits in hearing and in seeing, that children who grow up in linguistically impoverished environments will have language that is not as sophisticated or as advanced as children growing up in more enriched environments, and that children experiencing profound psychosocial deprivation early in life will go on to suffer consequences in social emotional development. Another is that we know that there are critical periods in brain development, again, these windows of opportunity and vulnerability where the brain is particularly receptive to experience. Examples, again, would be children who are deprived, whose eyes are crossed or wander, or children with congenital deafness, or children deprived of adequate caregiving will all suffer consequences in the visual, auditory, and social emotional domains. But we also know if there's an intervention that happens early enough, you can right development to proceed on a typical and healthy developmental trajectory. Neuroscience is also, I think, made some inroads on our understanding of disorders of development. So in one of my lives, I study neurodevelopmental disorders like autism. If we think of autism and ADHD and dyslexia, are all disorders that are defined behaviorally. And this has, in a sense, limited us in a couple of ways. First, that doesn't work either. The phenotype is such that you have to wait for the behavioral repertoire to become sufficiently sophisticated to actually then identify a deviation in typical development. So in autism, it might be atypical language or atypical social relations. In dyslexia, it's going to be much later when you fail to learn to read. Same could go for number. The same could go for any number of disorders. And so I think that there are now tools in neuroscience that allow us to bypass behavior and identify the underlying neural substrate that goes awry long before behavior goes awry. So Nadine Gobb has demonstrated that in infancy you can already see differences in the brain that will become a brain that fails to learn to read. And I've demonstrated we can predict autism at 3 months of age, 3 years before you see symptoms of autism. I have no idea what this says. The other thing neuroimaging has done is it helps to elucidate the errors in brain development that lead to these disorders. So it's one thing to say this child has autism, this child has ADHD. What we really want to know is what's gone wrong in brain development and move beyond, again, the simplistic explanation of saying, well, it's a genetic error. I see children with a single gene mutation, and I can give an example of girls with exactly the same single gene mutation who are identical twins and yet have different developmental trajectories. A second problem with relying on behavior is that there's a great deal of heterogeneity. So the expression in autism is if you've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism. And the issue here is behavior is rather coarse. So I think neuroscience has enabled us to more finely splice disorders so that we should no longer be surprised that if everyone with the same disorder gets the same treatment, we shouldn't be surprised that they don't all respond the same way to that treatment. Only a subset of kids with autism respond to ABA therapy effectively. What neuroscience has done is allowed us to more finely splice those disorders into, say, autism A, autism B, autism C, to develop a more personalized and individualized treatment protocol. And finally, most intervention studies depend on behavioral assays to evaluate the efficacy of that intervention. And the problem is that this has limited us in a couple of ways. First, often we can't evaluate very, very little kids because the behavioral repertoire is limited. These behaviors may be too coarse to identify subtle benefits of treatment or intervention that behavior just might not observe, but looking at the brain might. And digging beneath the surface might help us understand how these neural measures will detect more changes that are not present in behavior. I'm sorry, this is really difficult. Might allow us to detect treatment effects earlier than if we depended only on behavior. So in conclusion, the next time For the rest of you who can modify your slides, make the font bigger because it's difficult to see this. The study of neural development should exist hand in hand with the study of behavioral development, that there are enormous implications of how this interdisciplinary approach for education. So to give you 3 examples, how to identify children who will subsequently struggle to learn to read, to do math, to engage in social relationships before the onset of overt symptoms, how to identify when in development the brain is maximally receptive to input, so think of second language learning, for example, and when the brain is most receptive to change. And finally, given the high prevalence of young children exposed to adversity very early in life, this will give us a sense of how these children's developmental histories will impact their educational achievement and educational attainment. And on that note, I can say the end. Thank you. Uh-oh. Howard has his hand up.
Howard. Martha, do you see Howard waving?
Can I sit down?
Yeah, you can sit down, Chuck. Thank you. Our next speaker is Nancy Hill, my friend and colleague Nancy Hill, a developmental psychologist who focuses on ethnicity and culture. She's also the president of the Society for Research and Child Development, and she'll be discussing the evolution of human development from her perspective as the president of the Society for Research and Child Development. Thank you, Nancy.
Today to witness the last 2 days and to really understand the history in which I came into 10 years ago. I am at this for just 1 decade. I have started my 2nd decade, and as I look at those around me who are celebrating and honoring many decades here, I can see why you stay. How I ended up here, I didn't know that I was intended to be here. But Kathy McCartney knew I was intended to be here. And I spent the first half of my career in a department of psychology, trying to do interdisciplinary work, thinking about prevention science and practice, and trying to do research for a common good when I got a phone call saying that there was a position open here. And I wasn't sure, leaving my discipline and coming into a school of education, but Kathy was wise, and she said, come for sabbatical, come for 1 year. And I thought, I don't know, 1 year, can I uproot my family? And she says, come for 3. And I think what she knew was that once I got a taste of this place, that I wouldn't turn back. And indeed, I have not. And so what I want to talk about today is an integrative developmental science for the benefit of adolescents. And as I think about our 100 years here today, celebrating with HGSE, and I want to give us some well, I guess I'm going to start with what my take-home messages are. Sorry. 3 take-home messages. If you don't listen to anything else, here they are. The field of human development is 3 things. 1, it's consistent in its quest for research to the benefit of human development. 2nd, it's marked by a quest to define new developmental stages. And 3rd, it's cyclical in that the field of human development started as a very interdisciplinary science. It became more specialized, and now we're seeing a season of integration and interdisciplinarity. So those are my 3 take-home messages. I could sit down now and you'd have the whole story. But I'm going to flesh it out for you a little bit. So 100 years ago, there was a move to link research, policy, and practice. And what you see is, 1 is the launch of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but also in 1925, the National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences founded the Committee on Child Development, which became, in 1933, the Society for Research in Child Development. And in the middle there, around 1927, you saw the start of the Child Development Abstracts, which became the Journal of Child Development, which is still one of the top journals in the field. And what the goal of the Society for Research in in child development, the goal is, at that time, and still is, to stimulate and support research to encourage the cooperation of individuals engaged in the scientific study of child development and to encourage the application of research findings, to really, right from its start, to see the application of science in practice. And at the same time, we saw at this time a rise in the institutes for child development that were housed in land-grant institutions. Howard, when you talked yesterday about the faculty that comprised the early construction of human development here, many of them came from the flyover states in the Midwest. They also came from land-grant universities that have a core mission to give back to society. And Pat Graham, you were at Purdue, which is also a land-grant institution, and I am from Ohio State and Michigan State, which are also land-grant institutions. So there was this deposit here right at the beginning of a land-grant philosophy of doing research for the good of society and to help people to prepare for the economy and be upwardly mobile. Also, what we see a little over 100 years ago is the quest for a new developmental stage, and this is G. Stanley Hall, the father of adolescence, who received the first PhD in psychology here at Harvard. And in 1904, he published a 1,400-plus treatise on adolescence that was, you can see in its title, Inherently Interdisciplinary. And what he argued was that we had a new developmental stage of adolescence, and in recognizing that you now had this extended period between childhood and adolescence, and you needed this additional time in order to prepare to succeed in society as American society was moving from an agrarian economy into an industrial economy. And related to this, at the very same time, we saw a rise in the high school movement, which was preparing people who were coming from the rural areas into the urban areas so they could compete in the job market. So you saw this rise in the high school era at the same time. So again, we're seeing this convergence of research and practice and application and in support of upward mobility. And so you saw this idea of the high schools that were preparing many people, and this was a time when women were being educated even more so and benefiting from that, so they were prepared in the post-World War II era to join the economy. And so you had this convergence of preparation for adulthood that was aligned with what we were doing in education. But in the late 20th century, things changed since the 1970s, and so there's been this question of whether or not we have this new developmental stage. And so youth today are reaching many of the milestones at the end of adolescence later than before, and so there's been this call that there might indeed need to be a new developmental stage, emerging adolescence or emerging adulthood or extended adolescence. But the question is there really a developmental stage that's new? And this begs the question. It's not new to the late 20th century and early 20th century. We have seen this before. And I'm going to give you one indicator, which is age of first marriage. I'm going to show you this slide that begins in the 1890s. And the average age of marriage in the 1890s was 26 for men, much younger for women. And then it declined over the course of the 20th century till it reached its nadir in the 1950s. And then we see this increase. You see this increase in the age of marriage as we move post-1970s. And so what we had in the early 20th century was this transition to a new economy and this need for new skills, and we're seeing that again today. And this age of marriage marks very similar kind of markers of age of departing home and developing your own home. And all the markers of adulthood, you see the same curve. And so what we have now is then we see this separation or this disconnect between what our education system is doing in terms of preparing youth for the new economy. And so there's been this quest for a new developmental stage. But I don't think that we really need a new developmental stage. I think we know what to do with the data that we have. And so our education system as it is today is misaligned with what youth need to succeed in the economy. But what we have today that we didn't have in the past is an integrative knowledge of developmental science to better prepare youth. And so when you look across the century, we've witnessed an increase in research on adolescence because we've defined it as a developmental stage. And so we see this in terms of sociological research over the 20th century with people like Glenn Elder and his life course theory and the coming of age and the timing of poverty and its relationship to outcomes. You see this psychologically with Erickson as an example, looking at identity as a key factor that adolescents grapple with. We look at this cognitively when you think about just Piaget and the understanding of abstract thinking as something that's unique to adolescence. And then you also see it in neuroscience, where people like Geed and others have identified adolescence as a period of brain development that creates a unique and new opportunity to make up for past exposure, but really to prepare youth with the skill sets they need. And so when we look at those separately, and they've begun to come together in this new report that's been put out from the National Academy of Science called The Promise of Adolescence. And in this report, we've begun to integrate, I sat on the committee that authored this report, and what we've begun to try to do is integrate what we know from the social science and from neuroscience and cognitive science so that we can begin to create the kind of context that we need adolescents to develop in. We knew what to do in the early 20th century. We need to do it again in the 21st century. So what we're seeing is that it's cyclical in terms of interdisciplinary work to more specialized work, and now we're seeing an integration of our knowledge on adolescent development. So with this understanding, we see adolescence as a new opportunity. And with my colleague and good friend Alexis Redding, we have a new book that's going to be coming out that answers some of these key questions. Is there evidence that there is an extended path to adulthood that existed in prior generations? And we suggest that there is. And the question is, do youth need more time to make this transition to adulthood? And some of our data suggests that perhaps they do, in part because they need different skills than they needed in prior generations. If that's true, are we shortchanging youth who we press into maturity at the age of 18 for a wide variety of reasons, because they're not going on to higher education or policies that are pushing them into adulthood before they're truly prepared? And if that's true, what should young people be doing with their time? And this is where Alexis Redding and I have used some historical and archival data to understand what we know that youth should be doing that's not necessarily about grades and test scores, but really getting at the kinds of dispositions that youth need and the skill sets they need and the cognitive flexibility that they need to succeed in today's economy. That in part we saw coming out of the report from the National Academies that I just mentioned, but we saw evidence of in a college sample early on. And so what do youth need to kind of envision and prepare for adulthood? We found that they needed a set of dispositions and skill sets. And one is they need these goals and aspirations that they have to succeed and to understand what the economy has to offer them. But more than that, they need a sense of purpose that extends beyond. And I know Bill Damon is going to be joining us, and a lot of the work that we've been doing really builds on some of his work of understanding this sense of purpose, of who they are, why they are here, and how do they contribute to society. And I, too, am going to have trouble reading my own slides. Note to self, red on blue looks good on the screen, but not from a distance. Here we go. Help me out here. So the cycle of discovery and rediscovering the self, that we thought people in our sample would find themselves in college, but in turn, they don't find themselves in college. They learn the skill set of finding themselves again and again over the course of their life cycle. They need to build new communities and bridges between them. That part of going away to college, for example, you get this opportunity to build new social relationships, to endure what it means to be lonely, find new communities, and then connect back to your community at home. How do you go away and build new communities and then come back? Learning to make good decisions. A lot of what we want to do with upward mobility is give people more options, but we don't do a lot about helping them narrow those options. And so they need good skills around decision making. They need cognitive flexibility and divergent thinking so they can imagine a future that they cannot see yet. and they need to find strength from their challenges. There's no such thing as bubble wrapping kids until they get into adulthood. We need to give them opportunities to try things out, to fail at them, to learn from them, and take those lessons into the future. And so these are the kinds of skill sets that Alexis and I have discovered in our research that's consistent with what we understand around what youth need today. And so with that, they're doing this in the context of a perceptions of and the actual understanding of the economy, that this isn't something they just need by themselves in isolation, but they need to do this in traction with their understanding of what the economy offers. They're doing it in the idea of understanding their development of their own human capital, their credentialing and signaling. What does it mean to have a college degree as a signal? And then what does it mean in terms of building the kind of human capital that they need to succeed? They're doing this with a sense of strength and sense of self and efficacy and identity. And lastly, they're not doing this alone. They're doing it in the context of schools, communities, and family support, and learning how to build those structural supports. And so with that, that brings us back to the field of human development, my 3 things that I want you to take away, which are that there's this consistent quest to really link research to the benefit of human development. And if we understand what youth need, then we can use that knowledge to build the kinds of educational context that youth need in order to succeed in the transitioning to adulthood. Secondly, there is this quest to define new developmental stages, but as they say, there's nothing new under the sun, so we should learn from our prior lessons and take this forward into the future. And finally, that this work is both inherently interdisciplinary, it benefits from specialization, but only to the extent that we can come back and integrate our knowledge for the benefit of youth. And I'll leave this here. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Katie Davis. Katie Davis, Katie Davis was a student of mine, a doctoral student of Howard. She is the author with Howard of the App Generation. She is a professor at the University of Washington who explores the influence of new media technologies on young people. And she is going to speak about how human development contributes to our understanding of young people's use of media and technology. Hi, Katie.
I think I might be the last formal speaker, and I think you might be happy to know that I only have 8 slides, including this one. So as Rick said, my name is Katie Davis, and I direct the Digital Youth Lab at the University of Washington. And I know what you might be thinking, but don't worry. I have been living in Germany for the last 1.5 years, and I haven't been in Seattle for quite a while. So I really feel truly honored and delighted to be here. I started actually as a master's student in 2001, actually September 12th, 2001, and Howard was my first lecturer after 2011. September 11th. And then I was a doctoral student. Actually, as a master's student, I was, I believe, one of the first cohorts in mind, brain, and education. When I came here as a doctoral student in 2005, I also picked up another master's in risk and prevention. And so I've actually spent far more time in the audience of Ask with Hall than on the stage. And I have to admit it feels a little bit overwhelming to look out and see so many of the professors whose classes I took or whose courses I was a teaching fellow for, or in many cases both. So I see Noni Lasso. She was one of the professors from my first year doctoral pro seminar. Judy taught me about residuals through a comparison of regional French wines, which I still think about when I buy wine. And John Willett taught me about logistic regression through a lot of gesticulating and Bob Dylan quotes and jumping up on tables, which we have already seen a little bit about. But of course, I spent the most time with my beloved advisor, Howard Gardner. I was his student, his teaching fellow, his collaborator, and co-author of the App Generation. And I am very grateful that he invited me here today. In many ways, this feels like a homecoming, except it's kind of the kind of homecoming where I feel like I might get a grade at the end. So it's a little bit unsettling. What could I possibly say to this group of people who have taught me so much? My only solace is that my topic, technology, is not one that this particular slightly gray-haired audience is especially well known for as being early adopters or at the cutting edge. Okay. So I'm going to address 3 questions in my remarks. I'll start by taking stock of a few key shifts in technology that have affected research involving young people's experiences with technology. I'll reflect on what the field of human development has contributed in this area of research, and I'll end by talking about the kinds of contributions that I think the field is well poised to make. So let's start with what's changed when it comes to studying kids and technology. See, I think I'm already on slide 4. I think one of the central shifts is well represented by this pair of New Yorker cartoons. If you can't see, I'll read it out to you. The one on the left is from 1993, and I suspect it's quite familiar, actually, to a bunch of you. It shows one dog explaining to another, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. So flash forward about 20 years, and the dog now recollects a bit wistfully. Remember when on the internet, nobody knew who you were? So as I said, I came to Harvard in 2005 to pursue my doctoral studies with Howard and Kurt Fisher as well. And this turned out to be a really interesting time to start researching the role of technology in adolescent development. And that remains a focus of my work today. So in 2005, there were some pretty key shifts underway when it comes to technology. So if you think back to that time, 2005, what do you think, can you remember what the sort of big platform that had just come out the year before was? Does anyone know? Facebook, yes. Facebook had just been launched probably just over there, a few hundred yards in Harvard. 2005 was also the same year that another platform started. Does anyone know that one? That's extra points. No, MySpace was before Facebook. This was YouTube. So I watched my first YouTube video. I think someone in my cohort here at Harvard sent me a link to some cat skateboarding or something. And 2005 was just a couple of years before the very first iPhone was released. So essentially, this is when digital devices became increasingly ubiquitous, and our online and our offline lives started to become fundamentally intertwined. And so what these developments meant for scholarship in the field of human development was a real shift in how we think about the role of network technologies in young people's lives. And this was particularly apparent in my area of focus as a doctoral student, adolescent identity development, which is something that Nancy touched on. The literature I read as a student came from the mid to late 1990s and early 2000s, and it very much aligned with this first cartoon. So for teens in particular, there was this both excitement and a little bit of nervousness that they could go online and enter a completely different world where anything goes, which meant they could experience unprecedented opportunities to try on different identities in seemingly low-stakes environment. However, when I started to conduct my own research and talk to teens around 2008, 9, and 10, I was hearing a very different story from them. I wasn't hearing them tell me about the freedom they felt to try on different identities online. Instead, they were telling me about the pressure they felt to be always connected, always public and visible, essentially always on. And since their friends were watching them, they had to be really careful not to veer too far from how they presented themselves offline. So the stakes felt much higher than they did about 10 or 15 years earlier. And a lot of my work studying identity has focused on documenting the shift in online context between 1993 and 2015 in these two cartoons, and really bringing a developmental perspective to understanding how teens approach the opportunities and challenges of identity expression and exploration online. Now, of course, there have been a lot of other changes in research at the intersection of human development and technology during this time period, and these changes have affected youth who are both younger and older than adolescents. But I would say that many of the changes relate to this overarching shift towards ubiquity and constant connection. So in the midst of this shift, what have scholars in the field of human development brought to the study of kids and technology? First, I think the field has done a lot to help put young people's technology use in context, and this has, I think, been a through line throughout the last 2 days. Kids use technologies in a variety of different ways for a variety of different purposes, and their technology experiences are shaped by the many different contexts of their lives, not just online. Their family life, their school and after-school experiences, and the kinds of communities they live in and the kinds of resources available in those communities. Our collective work in the field has furthered understanding of the developmental underpinnings of young people's technology use. And I think this helps us to normalize what youth are doing online and with their devices, recognizing that the behaviors that we're seeing, they may be new, but the underlying motivations are not. And they come from enduring developmental tasks, such as forming peer relationships and exploring one's identity. And an important part of placing technology use in contexts like this is also to get super specific, steering away as much as possible from looking at how the elusive average child is affected by technology and recognizing instead that the wide variety of ways that young people use technology and the context surrounding their experiences means that it doesn't really make sense to say things like Instagram is good or bad for teens, or violent video games makes kids more aggressive, or 3-year-olds like my son should spend no more than 1 hour a day in front of a screen. When we're on a plane, he spends a lot more than an hour on a screen. So instead, we should be looking at how individual children use different kinds of technologies in specific ways, and how these uses lead to a variety of different outcomes. And I think developmental scholars are particularly good at framing their research in this way. So lastly, what contributions is the field especially well poised to make going forward? So I'll focus on 2 main categories of contribution. First, new empirical and theoretical insights, and second, real-world impact. And I think the first category, new insights, really comes from what scholars in the field of human development are already doing and already contributing. As I've discussed, we're good at getting specific and placing children's technology use in a broader context. So this specificity will be increasingly easier to do as new methods, like the one, if you could play in this video, the one you hopefully see here playing on the slide, are introduced. Now, I have to say I'm a little bit ambivalent to highlight this particular example because it comes from Stanford and not Harvard, but I think it's a good one. So I hope you'll excuse the source. So researchers at Stanford have developed a method of data collection that they call screenomics, which captures and represents young people's moment-by-moment smartphone activities. So we don't have to rely on their self-port and what they're telling us they do with technology, or broad generalizations about their uses of technology. Instead, we can see in real time what sites they're visiting, who they're talking to, and what sorts of content they're consuming and creating. And as you can imagine, this kind of a method here produces an enormous amount of data. So the data scientific methods that Judy mentioned earlier today will become increasingly important for this kind of research. And the picture that emerges from research like this is one of enormous variation across individual youth, which is what Chuck mentioned earlier. And even within individual youth, variation across time and context with respect to their digital media activities. And methods such as these will really support the kinds of contributions that scholars in the field of human development are especially well equipped to make. So I've been thinking about what these contributions might look like, specifically while listening to the presentations over the last 2 days. So I'll share just a few of the research questions that I've jotted down in my notebook over the last couple of days. And some of them I acknowledge are already being pursued. But things like what factors affect children's trust in the testimony of what conversational agents like Alexa and Siri tell them, as opposed to what adults tell them. And when young children talk to their grandparents over Skype or FaceTime, are they more likely to engage in decontextualized or here and now conversations? When parents are busy responding to notifications on their phone, does this affect the kind of language they use to talk to their children? Can virtual reality be used to teach perspective-taking skills and empathy? I'm really excited to see some of these kinds of questions being explored and answered by scholars in this field. So I'll end my remarks by reflecting a little bit on impact. How can scholars in the field of human development use their work to create real-world impact, which I think is a real strength of the Ed School here? With my home base in Seattle, again, I haven't been there in a year and a half, I'm surrounded by technology developers who are inventing the next Instagram or TikTok or Fortnite. Odds are, however, these developers know next to nothing about human development, and they're probably not talking to the people who do. Although I'm very glad to hear that John Hanson is at Amazon. That's great. Of course, scholars in the field of human development can have meaningful impact by explaining the effects on children of existing technologies, and that's really important. It's one thing that I do. But wouldn't it be great if we could also contribute our knowledge and expertise as new technologies are being developed? So a thought experiment that I'd like to leave you with today is what would happen if a developmental scholar were added to every child-related product team at Facebook, Google, and Apple? Thank you.
Years, I'm hoping that Kathy and Marcelo can come on up. Let me sit here in these three chairs. I don't know that Kathy and Marcelo need an introduction, but I'll do a little introduction. Kathy is my not my former friend, my friend, my colleague, was a colleague, was my dean. She's also the president of Smith College. And there are a few of you that may not know this, but Kathy is also a developmental psychologist and a wonderful developmental psychologist who made tremendous contributions to the field. So it's a delight to have you here, Kathy. It's a delight to have you back. Marcelo Suarez-Orozco, I think you all know too, but he is also a friend and a former colleague here. He is the dean at UCLA, and I am delighted and thrilled to say that he will be the president of UMass. So big hand.
Chancellor.
I'm sorry?
Chancellor of UMass.
Chancellor, my bad, Chancellor. All right, so I'm going to engage them, and has Bill joined us?
Yep.
There's Bill.
Great. Hi, Bill.
I think, am I there?
Yeah, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're like on the mountaintop. You're oracular there. So.
Great. Well, I just want to say how delighted I am. I think that many of my mentors, closest colleagues, and closest friends are in the room right there. So it is a very special privilege for me to be able to join you, even at a distance. So hello, everybody, and I'm just delighted that I'm able to hear this and listen to what's going on.
Well, it is great to have you here, Bill. And for those of you who don't know Bill is a professor at Stanford. He runs the Center for Adolescents at Stanford. He's done wonderful work on moral development. He's been my most important mentor in my work on moral development and on parenting. And he also now does work on purpose. So we are delighted to have you here too, Bill. Thank you. So we wanted to engage in a discussion about the future of human development and where it's going, what we hope for, what we worry about, how to avoid the things we worry about, how to move it closer toward what we aspire for it to be. And but let me start just by asking you about what you've heard in the last couple of days. What has rung true for you? What might you take issue with? Anything that comes to mind.
Do you want me to go first? Well, I thought I'd say a few things. One is when I think about, and maybe this is related to the future.
Yeah.
Because when I think about the history of developmental psychology, I think about the importance of assessment, actually, and how when you know how to measure something, it can really help an area develop. So I was very happy to hear about Paula's measure, the COWS measure, for example, and that seems like it might have terrific promise. But in general, I think there are disincentives for people to work on measurement development. But imagine the study of attachment without the strange situation, right?
Yeah.
So I think that was exciting to me and something that I'd like to see more of. I was also excited to see all of the intervention studies that people are doing. I mean, Chuck didn't really talk about his, but Meredith Rowe talked about a really exciting intervention study that her doctoral student had engaged in. And throughout most of my life, I engaged in correlational studies because they were real-world problems that I wanted to know the answer to. But I do think there are huge advantages to experiments and to offering those kinds of programs. So I was just, I'm going to leave here today being very excited about the future of human development research. I could go on, but you have a turn.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Kathy. I'm so happy. I'm so honored to be here at the podium with such wonderful friends, especially celebrating Bob and Howard and Catherine. The Romans said all roads lead through the Appian Way to the epicenter. But that Appian Way was built 2,400 years ago. And of course, the GPS that got so many of us here, it was Pat Graham. And my journey to Appian Way began with Pat many years ago. As we were trying to create a new endeavor to understand how globalization was changing the world and how the human face of that globalization was going to be the great demographic transition that we're now all living with. So I just want to say thank you to Pat, and thank you to all the colleagues. Of course, it's such an enormous treat to see Bob, one of the giants in anthropology, that did so much to manage the complex conversation between culture and psychology in human development. So I'm simply delighted. What I see as, I also love the transgenerational nature of the conversation. It was wonderful to hear Katie and her younger colleagues, as well as those of us with gray hair. So what I see as enduring issues that are with us and that are very exciting and that will, I think, continue to be with us. And I just listed a few. The issue of disciplinary and interdisciplinary endeavors in the purposeful, organized pursuit of understanding systemically issues pertinent to human development, very broadly defined. And interdisciplinarity defined sort of the earlier iterations. I think Professor Hill made that point very eloquently. And I think those issues will remain with us. And interdisciplinarity, of course, presupposes two things. One is the respect and proceeding with caution on matters pertinent to the knowledge that lives, for reasons that are very obvious, within disciplinary tradition. So before you get to the inter, you have to have an understanding and competence over the disciplinary domains. But interdisciplinarity does the most for human development now and moving forward, in that it interrupts the taken for granted categories that come to colonize scholarly discourse within the disciplines. And what I saw when I arrived here were these extraordinary conversations. Bob took me to meet John Whiting and B. Whiting way back, and of course the conversations on issues of language, moral development, and the work of our colleagues. So that is a defining feature that I think is with us and will remain moving forward. I think the other issue, and then I'll stop, is the issue of the individual and society. This, again, is part of the totemic ancestry of the field of human development and psychology. And I have to mention that 150 years ago, it was the great Durkheim who had the first chair in Bordeaux, in France, for pedagogy. And of course, Durkheim's endeavors flow from an understanding on the nature of the individual and the collective representations of society. And these are the tensions that live at the borderlines between psychology and anthropology and the allied social sciences. Of course, Rick Schrader has done so much of the just fundamental work in that domain. And Durkheim is very important for moral development because Durkheim influenced Lucien Lévi-Bruhl and Les Pensées Sauvages, the primitive mentality, which of course Piaget got imprinted on with Lévi-Bruhl and Durkheim. So there's an archaeology here. There's a kinship that also tells the story of how concerns over the nature of the relationship between the individual and society became constituted, and the tensions that flowed from the analytic constructs that came from research psychology, and particularly anthropology and the other social sciences. And the last is, of course, the issue of culture. And culture is so fundamental. And here, the concern over the vulgar reductionism of sort of culture as a unit of meaning and as a unit of analysis is something that has plagued and visited and revisited efforts in human development and psychology, and continuing the conversation about the complexities of human behavior. I'd like to stop now. My next set of reflections will reflect upon what I see as the fragilities and the new challenges that we see that I think flow from another issue that one of our younger colleagues named, which is globalization, something that I was very happy and fortunate to be so involved with in very early iterations. I think I taught the first course here on globalization and education, and with Doris Summer, we taught it jointly both at the college and at GSE and IS. But we'll come back to that.
Great. Thank you, Marcel. Bill, can we pull you in here?
Yes. First, let me say that I've really enjoyed hearing the stories of the people and the history, the ones I've heard over the last couple of days, and the pictures. Although I will say that when I saw the picture that Helen put up on the screen, I felt very bald and clean-shaven. Glad to see that Bob Selman is not bald. But I'd like to just say a couple of things, two things about not the people, which I know is the center of this occasion. It's been wonderful to hear. And as I said, all the people there mean so much to me. But I'd like to say something about a couple of the ideas that have meant a lot to me as a scholar at a bit of a distance from Harvard. But what the Harvard School of Education has stood for that has been, I think, for one thing, very important to the world and courageous, and that has come up today. In fact, one of them has come up in Marcelo's comments and both Chuck Nelson and Nancy Hill's comments. So let me just say two relatively quick things about two of the ideas that I think Harvard School of Education has stood for in the developmental work that it's done. One is that it really has stood for a whole person approach to human development. And this has not been easy. Over the last 20 years, as we know, the big federal policies, the big funders have gone to a narrow view of that the kinds of things that can be tested and standardized tests and so on. And the areas that, for example, Helen referred to as marginal, which I think she very correctly said have been the focus of a lot of innovation, are also the areas that are at the heart of what young people need to develop in order to have good lives and contribute to society and be good citizens. And of course, I'm referring to moral development, as Helen talked about, civic development, art, music, aesthetics, the way Project Zero has studied it at Harvard, and the cultural aspects too, which, and I know Rick Schrader hasn't really been at Harvard, he's been at Chicago, but I ran into his work really through B. Whiting and other people at Harvard, and he was very much on the scene, at least intellectually there. And so Harvard has, and of course Howard's work on multiple intelligences absolutely set the stage for this, as did Pat Graham's expansive view when she was dean of bringing all of these things in. So the whole person approach, and I think it's coming back now after 20 years in the desert or in the wilderness perhaps, but I see it coming up all over the place now in the field of education. But Harvard has always been there and stood for it, and given those of us that have believed in this a lot of solidarity and good ideas, and has kind of fought the good fight at a time that I feel really was needed in American education in particular. So that's one. And the second, the other one, is it's another fight, and another sort of good fight that has to be fought against reductionism and against the idea that people are determined by whatever their conditions are, whether it's biology or culture. Marcella just mentioned this, that there's a kind of a deterministic view that always has to be fought against. And of course, originally, when you go way back to the years of Larry Kohlberg and Bob Selman's work early on, it was the cognitive revolution that fought the good fight against, at that time, Skinner and behaviorism. I know that the first great blows were dealt by Noam Chomsky against Skinner, but he himself, in a lot of the work, I think, drifted towards a kind of a biological or nativistic determinism. And I think the work at Harvard has been truly interactionist, and this is the point I'd make, it has respected the idea of the mind, of the agency of human beings to actually play a role in influencing their own destiny. It's not all determined by external factors. And I give credit to Howard Gardner, who's managed to put the word mind in every one of his books, as far as I can tell, which I think is a great statement about this. But today, again, there's been a resurgence, there's been a rediscovery, for example, of Viktor Frankl's great work. And Frankl's work not only stood for the idea that people can overcome challenges and terrible conditions in their lives, but also beyond that, that people can learn from them and grow. And so challenges and terrible conditions, the human agency is such that it can actually provide a source of further growth and development. I don't think the fight against determinism and reductionism is ever over. There are always, for one thing, journalists love it because it's a single factor explanation of everything. They can always say, well, birth order, it's all about birth order because firstborns are this and the research says that, nothing else matters, or whatever it is. And I think the version of it today is often driven by interests in socioeconomic conditions, ethnicity, in a whole range of cultural issues that are very important to study and very important insofar as they prevent challenges, very important for us as citizens to do whatever we can to remove such challenges from young people's lives. But as developmentalists, we can never give young people or anybody, teachers or schools, the message that any of these conditions determine someone's destiny. And the data are there. Young people all over the world, all through history, have overcome every kind of condition. And we as educators can help show how this is done and how it's possible. And that's what schools and educators, and that's what our professional life is about. Harvard, I think, has absolutely stood for this. Nancy Hill's statement, Chuck Nelson just made a statement today that showed that the study of neuroscience is demonstrating that you cannot, that a neuroscientific condition is not deterministic. Experience plays a role, and I would want to put in the mind plays a role. So I have a lot of gratitude for what Harvard has helped me, how Harvard has helped me understand this, and what the people at Harvard, all of you people in the room, have instantiated this with your great work. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill. So let me just pick up on a couple of threads here, and let me start with interdisciplinarity. So in my sense is that we may mean different things by this word, and in my experience, there's been a lot of shifts in this in human development over the last few decades. That if we're really talking about drawing in deep ways from sociology and anthropology and literature and philosophy, that these disciplines in some, through many decades have been very siloed, and it still are very siloed. That we don't do a great job of this still in many respects. But what do you think? And do you think we should be doing more of it? If you do think we should be doing more of it, how do we construct a human development program so we do it very meaningfully?
Well, maybe I can start by talking about my experience early in my career, because I was an assistant professor in what was then called psychology and social relations here. And some of you probably know that when they built William James Hall, the idea was to have sociologists and anthropologists and psychologists all in the same building so that you would get more interdisciplinarity. And it didn't really work. And I've thought about why it didn't work. And I think one of the reasons is that we publish in disciplinary journals, those of us who are in the disciplines, and we belong to societies that are disciplinary in nature. So at least I think that's true in arts and sciences, right, with respect to psychology, in this case, sociology and anthropology. But what happens in a school of education, it mixes it up a little bit. Yeah. So all of you know this. I'm preaching to the choir, I think. But when you're in a school of education, you are united by the interest in the developing child. Everybody has an interest in the developing child, and you are more interested by nature in translational research. So those things are not true in the disciplines. In fact, if you are a member of the psychology department, and there's a psychology colloquium series, one day you might be learning about the deception of college sophomores in a social psychology experiment. The next week it might be about, cutting up rat brains for some purpose and so on. But here, at least for me, just about every colloquium was of interest to me because, again, of this common focus on the developing child. And that's what makes, I think, the study of human development in schools of education so very, very interesting. Just one more anecdote that goes to the importance of translational research. When I was in graduate school, I went to the Society for Research in Child Development meetings, and I still do when I can. But in graduate school, there was a big debate about whether or not the discipline should be involved in social policy at all. And I think at that time, so this would be kind of the late 70s through the early 80s, there was a debate at the business meeting about whether or not SRCD should be involved in social policy research at all. And I think it looked like there was going to be a vote not to have, a social policy journal or not to have an office in Washington, D.C. and so on. And Ed Ziegler, who was at Yale where I was studying, stood up and said something like, social policy is going to get made for children with or without our input. And shouldn't it be with our input? And, he explained about bills in Washington that were going to happen with or without our input. And I think that argument may be coupled with critical theory, which was just beginning to reach our disciplines, and maybe helped us be a little bit humble about truth with a capital T, helped the Society for Research in Child Development really embrace translational research. But it is still the case. If you're in a typical psychology department and you're doing translational research, that it's suspect in some way. So I think we shouldn't take for granted just how special it is to be able to be at a place like this, where there are some common beliefs that we take for granted. And yes, one is the importance of doing research that matters directly in the lives of children.
So I really wanted this to be a I really wanted this to be a conversation, so we can go in order. Bill, Marcelo, you want to jump in here?
I just want to say, in one of the most beautiful lines in the Spanish language, Pablo Neruda writes, "Soy muchos." What Walt Whitman, I think, meant when he said, "I contradict myself. I contain multitudes." Sounds better in Spanish. That's the point of interdisciplinarity in the context of a focus on a series of, whether it's in the translational domain or in the domain of practice, have a special life and a special set of appeals to younger scholars particularly. So we are many things, and our ability to respectfully, and again, avoiding the vulgar, and I think the term that Bill uses is so important. This is the vulgar reductionism that sort of psychically, as Professor Hill mentioned, sort of comes in and out of vogue. But we're many things, and I think interdisciplinarity at its best creates a kind of a culture of trying to listen and trying to understand different sort of fundamental constructs. And I think that's what's been best about the tradition of human development and psychology at HGSE. And certainly during my time here, and of course it was Bob and Sarah and the Whitings, but then so many others, that was the schema that I think guided so much of our work. Certainly our work with refugee children, immigrant families, displaced families. We've always endeavored to develop tools in what Levi-Strauss calls the bricolage mode of just the tools that will get you closer and closer to an understanding of the issues as framed by a multiplicity of communities and stakeholders.
Thank you.
Yes, if I can just celebrate what both Kathy and Marcelo have said, and just to add one note about how important it is, the message that Harvard sends out, the work that Harvard has done, the School of Education, on interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, meaning bringing in all kinds of things that other places have not seen fit to venture in. And I'll just give one example that recently came up in my experience, and has to do with art. Harvard's interested in art education, which is very unusual and very special. And I was at a meeting about a month ago that my friend Marcelo organized with Pope Francis, who gave a little talk to our group and ended with a comment, and my 8th grade Spanish is probably not exactly right, but Marcelo can correct it if I got this wrong. He ended with a comment saying, you know, one of the things that I always judge, when I judge what a good school is, does it produce any poets? Did he say that? Was that
yes,
correct?
exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so I understood that correctly. So just this idea that schools and children as individuals, choices, and schools should provide them, and we should have ways of educating across all of these different disciplines. That's so important, not just for the study, but of course for the study of human development. It's important for what Howard Gardner, in a very expansive note, calls studying the good, the beautiful, and the true. And that's what we should study, and that takes all of our capacities, but also for children in schools. And I just loved what Pope Francis said. I love the idea that schools have a responsibility to do all of these things, and Harvard has absolutely paved the way in studying it and encouraging it and helping schools do this in all of these areas that Helen indicated as marginal. She's absolutely right. They're marginal. They've been marginal in the field of education, but they are certainly not marginal in human experience.
I promised we would leave time for Q&A, so I think we only have time for one more question. But I would love your thoughts on sort of the big question: where do you hope the field will go? And where do you hope the field will go?
Well, I was really trying to take a big picture perspective today, listening to the range of, and yesterday listening to the range of work that's happening. And I was thinking about the fact that even in graduate school, I was really interested in what the child brings to interactions. So this would be, Arnie Samaroff's work on exactly that, what the child brings to interactions, and also influenced by Robert Plomin, who wrote a seminal paper on gene-environment interactions and correlations. And I think what has kept us from sort of taking these ideas forward is method, actually. Judy Dave Kenny at one point had a very complicated program that I managed to use where you could model mother effects and model child effects and model partner effects, but I'm not sure where that kind of research has gone. But I think we really need to think about that. And when I was listening to Chuck say, if you know one autistic child, you know one autistic child, that's essentially what I'm talking about. So what does the child bring to the interaction? It's so easy for us in education to want to model the things that we feel like we can manipulate, right? So maybe we can manipulate the home environment by training teachers better, or maybe we can manipulate the school environment in any number of ways through the curriculum or teacher training, all of these things. And we might think that we can't manipulate the child, and even if we can't, it doesn't mean that our interventions wouldn't be better if they were tailored to individual differences and predispositions in the child. So I would very much like to see more of that.
Great, thank you.
I think inequality is the gravest threat to the liberal democratic order the world over, and I think that rethinking and recalibrating how the tools of education can be deployed to disrupt these extraordinarily radioactive formations that, again, every family is unhappy in its own way, to quote a Russian writer. Increasingly, the world over, issues flowing from obscene levels of inequality are at the forefront of the challenge to the liberal democratic order. And education is maybe one of the most significant tools that can be a part of us thinking about the disruption of these just very obscene and very unsustainable patterns of both consumption and the growth in inequality. And I think that this will have to be a part of the agenda of our thinking and our research.
In our schools.
In our schools, I think Harvard should be at the forefront of those conversations. Certainly the land-grant universities, universities I come from, this is very much defines the center of the project. We at UCLA have a network of extraordinary community schools in the most underserved neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and they're extraordinary examples of what can be done to work with extraordinarily underserved populations in ways that are just simply create a kind of an effervescence and a kind of an engagement in young people that are fantastic and that show what can be done with good faith and with good resources and with good engagement. But I think that inequality is the fundamental issue for us. Now, I'm also stunned by the return, and this is something that Bob will smile at, the Herderian ideal that das Volk, that the language and the territory and the blood were part of a package for human development and the flourishing of the human being in the Aristotelian sense, that idea has come back with a vengeance to me. I find it, and it's the frontiers pushing against the cosmopolitan order of tolerance and of appreciation of other forms of life. To me, this is the second great threat, this vulgar theories of culture that Boas's enterprise was unmaking, coming back with in the form of the politics of ethno-nationalisms. Again, they're not just in our country, they're, today they're the world over. So I would say that those are the two concerns.
Right. Bill.
Well, I would second what Kathy said and what Marcelo said, and simply say that as we engage with determination in these difficult social conditions, and as we learn more about them, and as the world changes and presents new challenges and new problematic conditions, that we keep our eye on the great possibilities of human development, and that we use what we know as educators and developmentalists to help young people not just adapt to the conditions, but find ways to thrive. And I think that's our role as developmentalists to keep that perspective and keep the faith.
Thank you. All right, it's all of your turn. We would love to hear your questions, thoughts, comments. I'm going to ask, do we want people to go to the mics? Jess, thank you, Jess. Thank you for doing this. And I will also ask folks to be brief. Yeah, I'm sorry. Chuck, Nancy, and Katie, could you come back up on the stage? That would be great. So these are questions for all of these folks. Just because there are a lot of you, I will ask you to try and keep it brief, your questions or comments. So who would like to?
Excuse me, Rick, I would like to ask a question. Here's a question.
Yeah.
The Society for Research in Child Development was supposed to be a multidisciplinary organization, but in fact, it's totally controlled by psychologists. And that is a serious thing. Nancy is the president of it, but here, you know, it is so psychological. There's nothing to be done. Anyway.
Great. Well, thank you, Bob. Nancy, you want to?
Yeah, I can take that. President-elect, not president yet, but even so, you're exactly right. The SRCD, the Society for Research in Child Development, was designed to be interdisciplinary. And over the years, they've had various and sundry rules around alternating between psychologists and other discipline in their heads, in their president. So there's a concerted effort in every other year, every other election, to have a non-psychologist as president. And there is considered concern about the state of the membership and interest in attracting people from different disciplines into the field and into the society. But I think what often happens is that if you're in psychology or human development to study child development, SRCD is your home. But if you're an economist or a sociologist or a historian, you will find homes other places. And so I think what happens is that SRCD ends up being a secondary home for people who aren't psychologists. But if you're a psychologist or study human development, you're not going to go to APA. You're going to come to SRCD, and it's going to be your home, or SRCD and SRA, the Society for Research on Adolescence. And so I think it's in part the fault of SRCD in trying to attract a more diverse membership and governing council. But I also think it's the nature of where people like us lean in and find our intellectual home.
Thank you. You know, if you all don't mind introducing yourself briefly, that would be great.
Hello, my name is Matthew Kenny. I'm a current student in HTP, and I'm interested in how people find a sense of purpose through developing their own personal narratives. And I'm interested in how we can best prepare young people and people throughout the entirety of the lifespan to reflect on their complexity of self, the complexity of society, and the complexity of themselves within society.
Who wants to take that one?
Got it.
Well, I'll just say a word. I agree with you about the importance of self-reflection throughout the lifespan, and some of us do it or find ways to do it. At Smith College, they actually we have a center that is, Howard has visited it. It's the Wordle Center, and the whole idea is there's a narratives project. But we probably need to be thinking about ways for adults to do it. There are strategies, to get adults to engage in this kind of behavior. It seems like every other day is writing some advice about self-care and advice and so on. But I think you're right that it leads to a more fulfilling way of life. And so maybe finding ways to promote that in high schools and in colleges will enable that kind of to become a practice. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But it's a great question.
It is a great question. Other people have thoughts about this? Or Bill, do you have thoughts about this?
Well, my thoughts would take up the rest of the time. We have written a lot about this, and actually part of the Global Pact on Education that the Pope will present in May will be about education for a life of purpose, which I've written about, actually, a chapter for that. And so if you want to send to me, rather than try to do it here, if anybody just sends to me, I'll be happy to write the most recent version of this, which I wrote for Marcelo's conference and book on education for a life of purpose. I'll be delighted to send that along. I assume, Marcelo, that I can do that without violating any copyrights or anything like that.
You can do that without violating copyright. I need to talk to my attorney first.
It does strike me that there are people that we need to motivate to want to understand their complexities, and there are people who need the capacity to understand their complexities.
But I think those skills are the kinds of skills that people are going to need going forward as we become a more global society, to understand how to move from one community to the next, to understand what's part of their core central self and what they can learn and adapt to in the context of people who are diverse. I think one of the ways in which we come to understand who we are is to see ourselves in relation and in reflection and in similarity and in divergence with people from a wide variety of walks of life. And so we think about continual self-discovery over the course of the lifespan. It's in part putting ourselves constantly in a position where we can learn new things, be exposed to new ideas and new people, and get out of our shells where we like to be with people who are just like ourselves. And I think if we train that up early on, in our high schools that are diverse, our college campuses are incredibly diverse, but we don't take advantage of the kinds of programs and practices to help people to really understand how to be their core self, but also lean in and adapt to diversity.
Yes, my name is Martha Shiro, and I work in language development. So I think I have a comment or a doubt about interdisciplinarity, because I find that some disciplines cannot be monodisciplines. They are interdisciplines by nature, and language development is one of those. And as I'm a linguist, and it's a minority in the field of language development, I feel that there is a difficulty in combining views of one object of study with the other object of study, and then combining it within a theory, because it's always psychologists, who are the majority in this field, have a view of language which is not always the same as we linguists have about evolving our views of language. So that's one comment or reflection I have on interdisciplinarity. And then I have a curiosity related to technology, and that's a question for you, Katie. And it's about literacy and how this fast-changing technology affects literacy in such interesting ways. It expands it in a way that we couldn't have believed. I think that children younger than 2 already read and write in a certain way because they type. And at the same time, I think the way we read and write has been transformed by this technology, maybe for the better or sometimes reducing it in many ways. I would like your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I think that not so much these days, but I think maybe 5 or 10 years ago, there was quite a lot of hand-wringing about net speak and text speak and things like that, really diminishing young people's language. But at least within the scholars that I interact with most, I think there's an increasing recognition that the traditional literacies that are taught in schools are still very important, but the kinds of literacies that young people are encountering in online spaces, they may look different, but they are still very meaningful and very rich, and they're just as important to understand in this new environment as more traditional literacy. So I think both of them can live side by side and actually be integrated with each other.
There's a beautiful little book by Alberto Manguel, not the history of reading, but a book called Con Borges, with Borges. I don't know if it's in English. He was a young man, Alberto, who Borges was blind, and he had readers. And Alberto was his reader in all German. And the book is Con Borges. It's this 12-year-old boy who goes to the great man of letters, who's blind, and he reads to Borges. And I think the point of the little book is that why we read to converse, and Garcia Marquez put it, vivir para contarla, meaning we live and we read to converse, to have the exchanges that I think was such a part of one of our papers, I think in Catherine's session. So the purpose often of reading is also that human interaction. The question then becomes, with the new instruments, how they either detract or enhance the idea of a text as a point of entry to a conversation. And that, Katie, is a question maybe more for you.
Well, I mean, or even just transform the way we communicate meaning. So if you think about, if you have sent a message through text, or I use WhatsApp a lot to communicate with my relatives in Bermuda, I often will deliberate very hard about what kind of emoji I'm going to use to display just exactly the reaction that I'm feeling. And I use very different reactions when I'm interacting with my father versus my mother or my partner. And there's a little bit of an art to it, I think. And increasingly, actually, 20-somethings, 30-somethings have been writing novels on their cell phones and using this sort of new language and emojis and things like that. And I think, it's very interesting. I think all it's doing is broadening our language. I don't think it's diminishing it.
I wonder if I can comment on something that was behind your question. So we've had this discussion about interdisciplinarity, and implicit in that are pros and cons and how to deal with that. But we have another risk factor, which is insularity. So as our knowledge in any given discipline has expanded exponentially, there's been this natural splitting off. So a classic example would be, 20 years ago, you were a biology major. Now there's molecular biology, cell biology, neurobiology. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I'm on the steering committee for the Mind, Brain, and Behavior group at Harvard, and we've been discussing having a cognitive science concentration separate from psychology, separate from neuroscience. And so if this continues, there'll be disciplines that just don't talk to each other at all anymore. So is that the alternative to disciplines trying to talk? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think we need to be very mindful of both the implosion and explosion.
Yeah. You've been very patient. Go ahead.
Thanks for the wonderful panel. My name is Wen. I'm a visiting scholar to Harvard University. My field is higher education studies. I have a question about AI and its relation to educational studies. Well, in many parts of the world, we are seeing that programmers are playing a more and more significant role in educational practice. So my question is that, what do you think the impact of AI, the development of AI on educational studies and also human development studies, not only in terms of research topics, but also in terms of methodology and also paradigms? Thank you.
Would someone like to take that on? Good question. Anyone know about AI?
I'll take a stab. So I think actually I'll harken back to John Hanson's comments, and I think what he was talking about in terms of, because behind AI are just algorithms, and what I think is super important is keeping the human judgment. That's one thing, and I'm really glad that John talked about that, and I'm also really glad that Amazon hired him, because I think that's super important. And then I think the other aspect is who is creating the algorithms. And a lot of the times in Silicon Valley, the people who are creating the algorithms are not necessarily representative of the broader population. And that concerns me in terms of just technology development, but in terms of education, I really hope that when we start to increasingly introduce AI into methods and interventions, that the people behind that and their human judgment are representative of the broader population and the children who are supposed to be served by these interventions.
The other piece I would add to that is we think about AI and we think about algorithms, is that sometimes we perceive those to be static. And what one of my doctoral students, Avril Epps-Darling, is looking at is how these algorithms adapt to our interactions with them and how that puts children at particular risk, because as adults, we know that these algorithms are driving what ads we're getting on our apps or our surfing on the internet or what have you. But what she's showing is that these algorithms are diverging adolescents in terms of their identity development. So adolescents that have a strong identity development are able to navigate these algorithms and turn back from a road where an algorithm is going to send them deeper into an area, and that's where you get, as people talk about, the radicalization that happens on the internet as you get teased with some things and you're carried along in a way that is machine learning, but we aren't really skilled at helping adolescents and young people talk about that and understand that. We know how to talk to them about stranger danger, right? We know how to think about monitoring, but we don't know how to help them see that the pathways that they're taking on the internet take on a life of their own. They know to stay away from the stranger on the internet, but do they see the algorithm themselves as something that's dynamic and in interaction with them and driving them places that they might not necessarily go on their own?
Briefly, I think one thing we need to be mindful of is AI has made major inroads in health, using health records to make predictions about health. It's only a matter of time before the same thing happens in education. Taking what goes on in the classroom and making predictions about academic achievement and progress and things like that. And the data you put in determines what comes out. And so we need to be extraordinarily careful about that when we use test scores and performance and any number of things.
Judy, maybe we have time. Is it brief?
Well, it's more comments, so I'll
go ahead.
turn it into a comment instead of a question. About the challenges of interdisciplinarity, one of the things that I've observed, the main dilemma I see is that disciplines have canons and disciplines have accepted methods. And when you go to another discipline, you're not speaking the canon and you're not using the methods. And the fear, and this is a cautionary tale for you as the president-elect of SRCD, is that if you let in a lot of disciplines and there aren't dialogues about the methods, you risk becoming AERA, where there are no standards, my personal view, no standards, because there aren't well-accepted methods that are talking across these fields. So what I'm seeing is that and I'll use the word multidisciplinary, because people who are multidisciplinary have depth, and they have the methodological expertise in those different fields, and they can navigate those divides in a way that interdisciplinary people fall into a chasm, because they're neither fish and they're not fowl. And you see this also in emerging fields. Chuck was talking a bit about some emerging fields. I'll talk about the data science as an emerging field. There are deep disagreements between the statisticians and the computer scientists about what the canon is, what the methods are. The National Academy of Sciences had a consensus panel on data science, and they couldn't reach a consensus on a definition on what students at the undergraduate level should learn. So you've got these disciplines, each with well-accepted canons that are pretty well respected, yet they can't reach a consensus on it. And I think this is an issue for emerging fields, and it's definitely always going to be an issue for professional schools, because professional schools at their core, their strength is that multidisciplinary lens. So I think I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Judy. Big thanks to all of you. I know Noni wants to get up and have some remarks and a gift, but I made a T-shirt for Howard and all our panelists. I don't know if you can read it, but it says, "Searching for truth, beauty, and goodness." I wanted to reassure you that we will continue to search for truth, beauty, and goodness long after you're gone, and to thank you. You've been an inspiration for all of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. What a wonderful gathering and experience. In fact, I was just thinking this morning that in an era of too much email and so much remote work and these massive conferences with too many sessions, these last couple of days have been a major exception and a great reminder of the importance of coming together, to look back and reflect, to look ahead, and to engage in dialogue as an academic community. They have also been, as many have said, a testament to how unique the HGSE community is and the HDP tradition within it. So before we sign off in this room, I have a few thanks to offer. First, Jared and Jess and Jason and the IT team have been instrumental in this. Carolyn Crozier and the team in operations and Jody Bennett-Smith, our events manager, have put a tremendous amount of time into this event, as have folks in the Dean's office, Meg McDermott, Mitsuki Nishimoto, and Meredith Lamont. And with all the logistics in place and the great planning, and thank goodness for the timing, we were able to be joined by so many fabulous scholars and friends. And so I think a great big round of applause to all speakers and special guests. So finally, it was Howard and Bob's and Catherine's idea to hold this homecoming of sorts. And so I can't let us wrap up without honoring them and to acknowledge that in large part, it is because of their sustained contributions and dedication to HGSE as faculty members and citizens that this kind of program and set of conversations comes together. I have a special gift for each of them from the Dean's office, and even more than that, I want to say that you have brought us together as an extended community to rekindle relationships and dialogue and make this so memorable and meaningful. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of many when I say I am grateful for that. Here is some wine from the Dean's office. To Catherine. Come on up. So with that, we hope all of you walk across the road to Gutman Conference Center for a reception. Thank you.